Hi, my name is Arthur, and this is What's Pouring. I think people will often say that this whole concept of terroir, especially in the U.S. and in California, let's narrow it down, is a bit of a chasing windmills type of an enterprise.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of the questions that kind of revolved around that, you know, what is terroir? Is terroir the breath that predominates your cellar? Well, people wanted to know the following, and this following question is focused around terroir, and it's sort of a synthesis of two people asking kind of similar question. First is Jack from Nashville, and then we have David from Puerto Rico. And I've tried to put together kind of a longer question from that pulls the gist of both of their issues. What principles and lessons of terroir will you apply to the development of the San Juan Bautista property? And then, can you articulate what combinations of climate and gravel patterns or soil you look for when selecting to make a vin de terroir? So are the parameters for California different than they are in Europe? So it's a three-parter, but it sort of focuses on that whole elusive terroir pursuit.
Okay, Arthur, you're going to have to sort of pull me back in if I fail to address all the particulars.
Do you want the first one first?
No, I'll just kind of go for it. The idea of expressing terroir is that you're producing a wine that somehow captures the individuality of the site that you're growing the grapes on relative to the other places around it. And obviously, you need to grow grapes in a somewhat non-manipulated fashion, in a natural fashion, whatever that might be. And one of those, for me, one of the keys is non-irrigating. If you irrigate, you're essentially, one, you're not really expressing the characteristics of the vintage. So all vintages sort of become hydrologically equal. So you're canceling out vintage variation. The second thing you're doing when you irrigate is, especially if you're drip irrigating, is you're changing the natural rooting patterns of the plant such that you're getting a more constricted rooting zone, which I think is absolutely antithetical to the expression of terroir. Vines need to range widely and deeply to capture as much of the fingerprint of the site itself. And then lastly, I think you need to have very healthy microflora in the soil, because that's also one of the amplifiers of terroir. If the microflora, the mycorrhizae, bring the trace minerals to the plant, you need to have them really, really working well for you, because that's what amplifies the characteristics.
And for those who got a little bit lost there, Randall's talking about fungi and things that break down nitrogen and make minerals available.
Correct. I mean, the vines don't actively bring in micronutrients. They actually need these symbiotic associations in the root hairs of the plants to bring. It's kind of like the peep show barkers. You know, they need to bring the customers in off the street. So they need to bring them. They need to actually actively transport these micronutrients into the roots of the plant.
So then it's more of the microbiology of the soil than the actual geological patterns.
Well,
or is one dependent on the other?
Correct. So you need healthy microflora. You also need, under California conditions, you need soils that have enough water holding capacity. You need enough rainfall in the area to grow grapes, to support grapes. So you need enough rainfall, and then the water needs to be held in the soil. And then here's kind of an interesting conceit, and that is the idea that some soils hold water more tightly than others, and so there's a greater degree of homeostasis. What you're looking for is a soil that kind of doles out the water somewhat parsimoniously to the plant. It's kind of like a parent with an allowance, you know, not giving the kid all the money at the beginning of the week, but kind of like a little bit on Monday, a little bit on Wednesday, a little bit on Friday. And if you can do that, if a soil can do that with respect to the plant is able to kind of stay in balance and not kind of blow all the water early in the season and run out of gas. So there are certain kinds of soils that do that well. Limestone soils do that well. Clay does that very well. The right amount of clay, the right kind of clay. Too much clay, you got problems. But you need a minimum amount of clay
Just for water holding.
for water holding capacity. Yeah.
So, would you say that those general parameters or characteristics are unique to California, as opposed to say South Africa, France, Italy?
No, I mean a lot of our soils in California are not particularly good for terroirs. Sandy soils are dreadful because they have no water holding capacity.
Yeah,
And they just drain. There's a lot of controversy about this. Some people think that you can pretty much dry farm grapes anywhere. I don't know if that's true, but it's just you have to change your expectations of how much fruit you're going to get. Other people think, you know, just there's certain places you can do it, and certain places you can't, and you want to grow those in places where you can. You know, grapes are grown in some amazing places where it does not look like they should be able to grow grapes, but they do.
And this brings me to a discussion we've had outside of this about grapes, grapevines being suitable or adapted to their environment. You were urging me to put in own-rooted vines,
Yes.
which I can't get from a nursery. But the question becomes, if you're in hillside, if you're in an arid area, do you need to make that compromise and put it in on Polson, which is going to be better suited for the site?
Well, certainly, if you want, if you're growing grapes in harsh conditions, own-rooted vines are one of the best ways you can go if you don't have a phylloxera issue, because they are actually more aggressive than almost any rootstock.
Right.
So own-rooted vines are great, and you know, one of the things we're looking at doing is looking at the very old-fangled rootstocks like St. George, which are excellent for drought conditions. And there's also a technique if you're growing grapes without irrigation. You plant the vineyard in a very different way. You don't call up the nursery and order bench grafts, because bench grafts are sort of like the Marcel Proust of grapes. They're very temperamental. They're very fussy, hypochondriacal. You know, they're wimps basically. You need a very sturdy rootstock. So you establish the rootstock first in the field, and you give it minimal irrigation. And once the rootstock is established, you then go and you field bud. Yeah. I think the things that are important are the things that you can't change, that are sort of given. So the soils that you begin with are crucial. The microbiology can change if you don't use herbicides, if you don't use fungicides. You can restore the ecology of a soil. Certain kinds of soils have physical characteristics that encourage a greater proliferation. There's just more crevices and more places, more physical sites for these critters to hang out.
Gravelly types of soils, looser, lighter soils.
Well, or even just even micro. I forget what the precise technical term is, but like micropores within the soil for these root hairs to proliferate.
It's a bonus question.
Okay, great.
Comes from our friend Larry in San Ynez Valley, who is our winemaker. He asks, which of the wines you've ever made is your favorite and why?
That's a good question. You know, I'm going to answer there are two wines. I think make it three. What the heck?
It's your show?
It's my show, you know. There are three that I really, really like. One was and for slightly different reasons. The first one is the first vintage of Cigar Volant, the 1984. And I recently had it we did a vertical tasting of cigar and this was out of a very large format bottle, like 6 liter or 9 liter or something. And I think something happens when you're engaged in a project naively, that something special can happen that I think you lose as you become more sophisticated. And I think with cigar, I think I just got too cerebral or too something. I overthought it. And the early days, the first 2 vintages, the 84 and the 85, were actually the best of all the 30 some odd vintages that we tried. 25 vintages we tried. And when you're just kind of operating on this kind of instinctual basis, you don't really know exactly where you're going, I think amazing things can happen. So that's wine number 1. Then the other 2 wines I think that are fabulous was our last vintage of Syrah from our estate vineyard in Bonnie Doon, right before, as it was succumbing to Pierce's disease. And that was just, it was like the sunset moment. Very, very special. Pure Syrah character and bacony and decadent. This was the 94 vintage. Fabulous. And then the other one that just totally freaked me out the other day, or recently, was the Sophiste. We used to make a wine called the Sophiste, which was Roussanne, inverted commas, and Marsanne.
Which turned out to be...
Well, whatever. It turned out to be Viognier. The Roussanne actually turned out to be Viognier.
Right.
And I had a bottle of this in Magnum not too long ago. I think it was the 93 vintage. The wine tasted like a fresh young wine, and it was amazing. So, and again, this was based on a misunderstanding of what it was I was growing, and Viognier, a grape which is not supposed to age particularly well. So, I guess what I'm saying is that the anomalies, the misunderstandings, the things that happen that shouldn't happen, are often the most interesting aspects of the wine business. The things that you can control or you imagine you control often are quite banal and sort of beside the